50% of U.S. households live off of $30,000 a year or less. 63% of Americans don't have enough money in their savings accounts to cover a $500 emergency without going into debt. When you account for the rising cost of living or inflation, wages for workers in the U.S. have either been stagnant or in decline since the 1980s. All while CEO and executive salaries as well as bonuses have been going through the roof. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, no one can afford rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in any of the 50 states in the country working 40 hours a week at the minimum wage. As a reminder, the federal minimum wage is $7.25. Most states set their own minimum wage higher than the national rate, but a lot of the time it doesn't really make that much of a difference. For example, the state where I live, the state minimum wage is about $8.25. Now, what this does is it sets up a situation where wage slavery becomes very prevalent. And what wage slavery is, imagine having a set amount you have to pay in bills every month, but you have a job and it only covers about 80 to 85% of your bills. But it's better than no job, so you keep going there and you get paid only enough to cover 85% of your bills. Now, what this does is it creates a cycle of debt that you just cannot get out of because your employer is not paying you enough money to cover your bills, much less the new debt that you're adding on. I could get into some other statistics about the economy. The number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical bills, so they have trillions of dollars in unpaid medical bills in the United States. I believe there's a $1.5 trillion credit card debt crisis in the country because, again, a lot of people aren't making enough money to pay their bills, so they keep putting stuff on their credit cards, and that adds to their debt. And now the national credit card debt is $1.5 trillion, a record high. We also have a $1.8 trillion student loan debt crisis. Again, people are not making enough money to cover. First of all, we have the cost of education in college in this country has gone so out of control that people have to incur an insane amount of debt to pay for the college. And when they get out of college, and their job isn't paying them enough to pay back their loans, so they add a bunch of interest onto their loans, and the student loan debt crisis is now at a record high. Economist Edward Wolf did an analysis of public data and found that the richest 1% of the country control more wealth than the bottom 40%. Examples of that top 1% would be people like Jeff Bezos, whose assets are worth well over $130 billion. The man makes $150,000 a minute. I didn't just make that shit up. You can look it up. He literally makes $150,000 a minute. And like I just went over, 50% of U.S. households live off of $30,000 a year or less. And Jeff Bezos is over here making $150,000 a minute. More than 4 times what half American households make a year, Jeff Bezos is making in a minute. To sum this up, by design, under the economic system that we have in place, there will always be millions of people across the country who cannot afford to keep up with the cost of living or rent or mortgages because the government does not mandate that their employers pay them all a living wage. And there will also be a small group of people who benefit from the rigged system that become extraordinarily wealthy, like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and all these other rich billionaires. In a rational functioning society and representative democracy, once people are presented with those devastating statistics and facts, the only reasonable response is to find solutions to address the obviously unsustainable wealth and income inequality in the country. This is where grassroots movements like the Fight for 15 come in. They've made some big gains in the past few years by pressuring state and local politicians to make this a priority and actually raising their minimum wages to help workers in their communities. Cities like Seattle and states like New York. Now in comes Bernie Sanders, once again proving he's on the side of the working class and the bottom 99%. Recently, he's introduced a bill in the Senate to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. It goes without saying that this bill has almost no chance of passing with Donald Trump as president and the Republicans controlling the Senate. Nonetheless, I think this is Bernie Sanders doing what he does by keeping the fight of the working class in the mainstream discussion. Now that he's introduced the bill, there'll be some discussions about it, and some people will be forced to go on the record whether or not they agree with the $15 minimum wage. Mitch McConnell will definitely catch some heat over this because over 80% of the country wants to raise the minimum wage, and that's including Republicans in all those different pollings. Bernie Sanders has already drafted a bill to do just that, and all Mitch McConnell would have to do is bring it to the floor for a vote. But Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party has been bought and paid for by corporate money and billionaire money, so there's no way he's going to bring it up for a vote on the floor. Depending on how much coverage this bill gets, Mitch McConnell would be in a very uncomfortable position where he would have to explain to the American people why he does not want to do what 80% of the country wants him to, or why he won't even let it officially be voted on. So although we can all agree that this bill is most likely not going anywhere, I still think it's a good move by Bernie Sanders. It keeps $15 minimum wage and what voters consider to be top priorities in the discussion on mainstream media and in Congress. He makes the Republicans look bad because technically they're the only ones holding up a $15 minimum wage in the country, because Donald Trump will sign it and Mitch McConnell won't bring it up for a vote, and I'm sure there's some Republicans in the Senate who wouldn't vote for it if he did. And the same goes for the corporate Democrats like Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer. This will put them on the spot and they will have to answer, do you support a $15 minimum wage or not? Not a $10 minimum wage, not a $12 minimum wage, not $11, $15 minimum wage, tie it to inflation and unions. Do you support it, yes or no? This also reminds people ahead of Bernie Sanders' potential announcement that what he's saying on the campaign trail is not just rhetoric. What you see is what you get, campaign mode or not. Bernie is dead serious about implementing the policies that he talks about nonstop. Does anyone honestly believe that if Bernie Sanders was ever elected to be president of the United States and he had the opportunity to pass Medicare for all into law, that he would hesitate for a second? I'd be beyond shocked if that was the case. Bernie Sanders has been talking about single payer longer and more consistently than any other politician in the country. He's introduced legislation multiple times in the Senate in his historic presidential campaign that started a long-needed political revolution in this country. His top policy priority was passing single payer into law if he became president. He literally talked about it every chance he got at his rallies and interviews, debates. Anytime anybody asked him any question, policy or not, he'd bring up single payer. Out of that revolution started a movement to pressure politicians into supporting single-payer Medicare for all. Because of that, a record number of politicians in this country support a single-payer system, and that was not the case before. He changed the entire national discussion on the topic. So when he's on the campaign trail talking about it, I don't doubt for a second that Medicare for all is actually a top priority for him. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have disagreements over the kind of single-payer system is best for the country. Medicare for all, meaning the government covers all or most of people's healthcare costs, or a nationalized system like in the UK where the government controls all the hospitals and health institutions and research institutions in the country. You can even disagree with him on strategy. I know I do. I think he should be way more aggressive and uncompromised when it comes to pressuring other politicians to support single payer or even in interviews with the mainstream media. But Bernie has an unquantifiable factor that gives him a big edge over other people who want the 2020 Democratic nomination. It's because he has a 40-year career and a record a mile long of fighting for the working class against the corrupt political establishment. So when the discussions are being had on whether some of these candidates actually believe in the left-wing populist policies or they're just saying what they think the voters want to hear, Bernie Sanders' integrity and commitment when it comes to his policy positions cannot be questioned by any of the other candidates on the stage or by the mainstream media, because he's been aggressively pushing for these policies longer than any of them. In conclusion, even though the bill almost certainly won't pass, at least for 2 years, I'm glad Bernie Sanders introduced it for the reasons I already went over before. As usual, Bernie Sanders reminding us all why he's the most popular politician in the country.